Hello and welcome ABC members and supporters. I'm Kelly Wood, Membership Director at American Bird Conservancy, and we're thrilled to have you all joining us today for this Bird Conservation Magazine Q&A. This is a special webinar just for you, an exclusive opportunity to hear more and ask questions about some of the featured topics and articles in the latest issue of Bird Conservation Magazine. Unlike some of our webinars, this one is not open to the general public and is for ABC members and supporters only. In today's webinar, we'll have 4 presentations from American Bird Conservancy staff and take questions at the end of each, and hopefully have time at the very end for more questions for our presenters. Everyone is muted, but feel free to use the chat if you want to share who you are and where you're calling in from. And please, put any questions you may have into the Q&A Zoom box. This webinar is being recorded and a link to it will be sent out afterwards to all registrants. And please note, we do have automated closed captions available for this webinar, and information on how to activate those is being provided in the Zoom chat. And with that, let's get started with our first presenter, Michael J. Parr, President of American Bird Conservancy and the author of this issue's Bird Eye View, Conserving Habitats for the Love of Birds. Mike, over to you when you're ready.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks to ABC staff for participating and helping to set up this webinar. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else does as well. Thanks to everyone for joining, and thank you for supporting ABC. We really appreciate your support and know that we can't do our work without it. So it's really vital to us, and thank you so much. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my opening column, and I usually write something for the magazine, sort of a forward, although other people also share that from time to time. And I was asked to write something for this particular issue, and I'd just gotten back from a trip to California and Arizona, and I was thinking about that trip a lot when I came to write this piece. There are a couple of things that occurred to me, and I think one of them was sort of circulated around the whiskered screech owl in particular. And the whiskered screech owl, I knew about whiskered screech owl, and I knew it was a bird that I hadn't seen because I keep my eye on owls a lot because I love owls. I think like everybody, every birder knows that owls are special. They're sort of a special category of bird. Anyway, I knew about the whiskered screech owl, but I actually didn't know that much about it. It's never a species that comes up to the top of conservation priority lists all that much. And I kind of thought it was a difficult bird to see. And so when I started planning this trip and discovered that whiskered screech owl maybe wasn't as hard to see as I'd originally thought it was, and that there were quite a few sightings around Madera Canyon in Arizona, which is a big birding place. And if you've never been there, it's super fun to go down there. There's lots of birds there. Including the whiskered screech owl, but a lot of other things as well. And there's one really nice set of feeders. There's Rivoli's hummingbirds there, Arizona woodpeckers, lots of great birds. It's fun birding. So anyway, I don't always imagine whiskered screech owl would be this species that's found in rather remote, difficult to find areas. And when I went to Madera Canyon, I discovered that the best place to see it is actually right next to a sort of community amphitheater, where there are performances and musical activities go on with the community that's been cleared. It's got seating, it's like a circle, like a typical amphitheater with circular seating, and there's a kind of a bridge over the river there. And that's where I ended up seeing the owl, is right next to this little amphitheater. And it got me thinking about birds and habitat. And of all the birds that I've seen in North America, and I have a sort of personal quest to try and see all of them eventually, it just got me thinking that most of the birds I've seen haven't really required a huge wilderness experience to see. And if you look at a couple of the other birds on this page, the violet-crowned hummingbird and greater peewee, the hummingbirds, coming to Patton's Hummingbird Center, it's built up area, it's not heavily built up, but it's a suburban area in Patagonia, Arizona. I saw the greater peewee in a park in, it's actually in Tucson. There was a park in Tucson. It was a very very popular park, lots of people there. And the peewee was just in one little group of pine trees, and it was sallying and grabbing insects. And it just made me realize that even some of the more obscure birds can coexist with people. In fact, if I think back, there's really very few birds in North America that I've had to really sort of backpack into the wilderness to see. Almost all of them have been around people. And it makes me think that habitat is really important, but birds can coexist with us if we do a good job on managing habitat. And what they really need is somewhere to nest safely and plenty of food and the right type of habitat that's managed properly. And that's something that ABC really focuses on, is making sure that bird habitat is well managed. And that's everything from buying land for reserves in Latin America, but also working with private and public landowners in North America to make sure that the places that birds need are managed as well as they possibly can be. And you know, you may have gathered by now, if you didn't already know, that I was born in England, and I go back to England from time to time to see my mom, and I've begun to realize that in England they have started to manage to restore some of the rarest species that have been lost from the country. Like the red kite was never completely lost, but there's very, very small numbers. Reintroduction programs have red kites. You see them almost when you arrive at Heathrow Airport. It's kind of like the bald eagle here, or the brown pelican. Conservation can succeed. And while birds do need habitat, they can coexist with people if we manage habitat properly. So that's like a big theme for us. And it gives me hope that we can succeed with our mission, because I do know that even obscure birds like the whiskered screech owl can do quite well around people as long as they have enough habitat. The last thing I want to just mention is a thought about what is habitat and what is habitat conservation, because when I usually picture habitat, I mostly think about trees, grasslands, rivers, marine areas, but humans are pretty much terrestrially based, and it's really important to consider that birds also treat the air column as habitat. So things like wind turbines, glass windows, things that actually interrupt their ability to fly are really important aspects of habitat. So we really regard that as habitat conservation as well as things like pesticides, which degrade habitat and prevent birds from feeding properly, from feral and free roaming cats, which degrade habitat. They can either catch and kill birds, or they can put birds off from nesting. They may move away when they see a predator. So it's really important to think very holistically about habitat, but that's how we approach it. And I just felt like this whiskered screech owl was sort of synonymous with this idea that we can coexist with birds. There is hope. It's just how we go about it, and really focusing on managing habitat well is really the critical factor. Of course, we've got to think about climate change, but that really affects habitat as well. We've got to make sure that birds have good habitat now and for the future. So these are all things that are important to ABC, and that was really what embodied my piece, inspired by my finding of the whiskered screech owl. So I'll turn it back over to you, Kelly. If people have any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. And once again, thank you for your support for our work on birds and their habitats. We really appreciate it, and it's vital to our work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And yes, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. At the time of registration, Mike, we did have someone submit a question for you. This question comes from Sarah, and it says, what can people do to make their backyards better for birds? And where do you see the role of backyard feeders in bird conservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it sort of depends on your yard, and I know some ABC members that I know have very large yards, and it sort of really depends on how much land you've got and what type of habitat you've got. Probably the vast majority of people like me have got a relatively smaller yard. I live in Washington, DC, but if you live in an urban or suburban area, like a lot of people do, I think just, trying to do some of the basic things like identify windows that may have a bird strike problem and finding ways to mitigate for that by putting some kind of deterrent on or outside the window, like a window film that ABC advocates for. You can find that on our website, www.abcbirds.org. Not using pesticides, I think, is helpful, and trying to leave some habitat. I mean, a lot of landscaping companies are always trying to make lawns look perfect and all the sidings look perfect, but nature likes to be a bit messy. So allowing things to be a bit messy, if you can tolerate that, birds are going to like it more. I put up house wren boxes. I've got house wrens nesting every year, which is great. I put a hummingbird feeder. I think they can be good. Bird feeders, I think, are beneficial. I mean, there's definitely some pros and cons, particularly if there's housefinch eye disease, which can pass on to other birds. But if you see that, obviously take your feeders down for a while. You can wash them. I use a small, light percentage bleach, which is the recommended treatment, and then make sure they're completely rinsed and cleaned and dried out before they're used again. Things like that. But actually, in the 3 billion bird loss study that people may have heard about, one of the groups of birds that is doing better are the resident birds, many of which use feeders. So while it might not be proven that feeders are helping those birds, they certainly don't seem to be hindering them. And they do bring a lot of joy to people. And I do think that they provide a useful service for birds, particularly in the winter. So those are some of the things I think you can do. If you have larger areas, there's all kinds of things you can do. ABC has an active program on forest management and grassland management. If you're interested, contact us and we can work with you to make some recommendations, and also looking at some of the federal programs which can provide incentives for landowners to help them manage habitat better. So there's a lot of different options. Those are a few of the things I think would be worth thinking about.
Great, Mike. Thank you so much. And with that, we are going to move on to our next presenter. Next, we have Daniel J. Lebbin, ABC's Vice President of Threatened Species, talking about how birding business in Ecuador innovate and offer a variety of experiences for visiting birders. Dan, when you're ready, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. We can advance the next slide, please. So this article in the magazine is all about how many people and families have set up businesses in this area of Northwest Ecuador, catering to bird watchers, and they're making a living off birds as an alternative to extractive industries, whether that be logging or converting forests in this area to ranching and cattle farming. And so this is an example of birds and bird businesses incentivizing forest conservation in this very biodiverse region. As you can see on this map, there are a bunch of eBird hotspots, and this is in a very green, lush area on the west slope of the Andes, just outside of Quito. So it's very accessible to an international airport, and there are a lot of different options in this area. Mike, our former speaker, and I were able to travel there in 2022, and we saw a ton of birds. We photographed a ton of birds, and for all these different birding operations to coexist, much like many bird species coexist, they each fulfill a different niche, a slightly different niche. And each of these birding operations offers a slightly different experience to visitors. And in order to do that, they've innovated a number of interesting ways to attract birds or help birders see birds and have a great experience watching them or photographing them. So next slide, please. So one thing that helps to find birds is knowing where they are. And so if you can expect a bird to be in a certain place at a certain time, that's really a good tool to show visiting birders. And so there are a number of birds in South America and the neotropics that perform these leks, these mating displays, including manakins and cotingas. And this is one example called the clubwing manakin. The males flip their wings behind their back, they rub their wing feathers together like a violin, and they make this really otherworldly sound, and it's a great experience to get to see and watch these birds. So this is one offering at the Milpe Bird Sanctuary, for example. But there's others like Cock of the Rock leks that are these big orange cotingas, and so this is one way that people see birds in this area. Next slide, please. It also helps if you can build infrastructure to get people closer to the birds, such as way up high in the treetops. So this is a canopy tower. I think it was 30 meters tall. It was up in the treetops at the Rio Salanche Bird Sanctuary. And we were up on top of this tower, and it gave us horizontal canopy views of beautiful birds, including this scarlet-breasted dacnus that would have been much more difficult to see if we were on the ground. And I'll also mention quickly that ABC helped support the establishment of this reserve many years ago with the Mindo Cloud Forest Foundation. Next slide, please. North American birders, of course, will be familiar with hummingbird feeders, and many of the innovations we saw in this part of Ecuador combine bringing birds in close proximity to where people can be with feeding systems. So hummingbird feeders are widespread in North America as well as in the neotropics, but down in Ecuador, you can see 12 species at a time at one feeding station, a very short amount of time. So it can be a really great experience to learn intricacies of hummingbird identification and just have not just diversity, but also numbers of individuals. Next slide, please. And some of these places, the birds have become really habituated to people. And as you can see in these photos, these are velvet purple coronets perching on cell phones and hands, and they're pretty used to people. And so you can get very close. And this also aids in photography. And there's some tricks that they have at these places to set up so that people can photograph these birds away from feeders as well. Next slide. So there's a lot of different kinds of foods that these operations can offer birds to attract different species. So fruit feeders are very common in this area. And so at Reserva Amagusa, they have fruit feeders set up for a variety of tanagers, including this mossback tanager, which is endemic. It's to this region. It also occurs, I think, slightly into Colombia. And they're set up so that for photographers, so that the bird, when it perches right above the feeder, you can get a really nice photograph that looks natural, but they're also so habituated that they will eat out of a banana being held in someone's hand. Next slide, please. So these innovations start to pile on top of each other. And so at this site, which is the birdwatcher's house, they have fruit feeders that toucans and all kinds of birds come to. And they've set up a blind that helps make the birds more comfortable coming to visit. And they've also set up a feeder underneath and hidden out of view in front of a reflecting pool. So if anyone is familiar with Washington, D.C., you can take pictures of the Washington Monument in front of a reflecting pool and get sort of a double image. Well, this is a setup so that you can get such similar double images of birds as they come to feed. And so it's just another way to have a different experience with a feeding station and get to see some really beautiful birds and get some really good photos. Next slide, please. So blinds are a really important tool for photography. It allows the birds to be more comfortable, particularly shy species. And this blind is at Rancho Suamax. It's a very simple, low-tech structure. And next slide. It's looking out onto a compost feeder. So compost is another way to attract birds because in this case, this is a pile of rotting fruit, mostly grapefruits, and that fruit attracts fruit flies and other insects, and those insects attract birds that want to eat them. And so hit next, please. This is the star of that show. It's a brown wood rail. It's a very shy bird that comes to this pile, and we were able to see it successfully as it walked through the forest floor. Next, please. One of the big attractions in Northwest Ecuador is Angel Paz and his private reserve that his family owns called Refugio Paz. And this is famous because he pioneered habituating ant pittas to being fed worms. And so now he's got about 4 species of ant pittas that will come when their name is called in the forest and be fed worms. And these are species that are really difficult to see otherwise because they're very shy and they stay in the undergrowth and they're hard to see unless they come to you. So this has been an amazing innovation in being able to show visitors birds, and it's a technique that's been replicated at many other sites in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru and elsewhere. Next slide. This is the last innovation I'm going to share, and it was the one that I had never experienced before on this trip. So there's such a thing called moth feeders, And the way this works is a white sheet is set up in the forest at night and illuminated, and that attracts a number of insects. This is a common technique that researchers studying insects use to collect insects, but this attracts insects, and then these diurnal insectivorous birds come and they pick off the insects and they feed off the insects off the sheet. And they will even come pre-dawn before it's even light out because they're smart and they can tell that this is a great way to get some food. And to me, this simulates an artificial ant swarm. So in these forests, what a lot of these birds will do naturally is they'll follow around army ants that flush insects, and they'll pick off the insects and eat them. But this is essentially an artificial ant swarm that's always in the same place every day. And so you can see ant birds and wood creepers and foliage gleaners like we did. And the star of this show at this location is a banded ground cuckoo, which unfortunately did not arrive the day we were there, but other people have seen and photographed it there. Next slide. So in conclusion, like Mike was saying, people and birds can coexist quite well. And at least in some areas like Northwest Ecuador, people can use birds as an economic generator. Places like Ecuador and Colombia and many areas are making it easier for birders to see birds and have these positive experiences. One exception that's kind of surprising to me is Costa Rica, which has a very vibrant bird watching scene, and a lot of bird watchers go there, but they actually passed a law prohibiting feeding of wild animals, including bird feeders. And although they're prohibited, I know that there are still some bird feeders that exist for public at some lodges there, but technically they're not supposed to. So I'll leave listeners with a challenge question, which I like to think about, which is what of these innovations might be applied here in the United States, either at local nature reserves, national wildlife refuges, or backyards? And then you can advance to my last slide, which is for questions.
Great, Dan, thank you so much. Great presentation and awesome pictures. Great to see all of that. One question that we received was, how do I plan a trip to visit places like you have shown here or other ABC projects?
So let me put this in the chat box, but we have a website devoted to providing information to birders to be able to visit many of our project sites. It's called conservationbirding.org. Let me type that in right now. And at this website, you can see profiles of the different reserves and learn more about what kinds of accommodations are offered there, as well as some links to different tour operators that you can reserve your trip through. In this case, in Ecuador, we use Jocotours, which is a for-profit tourism arm associated with our nonprofit partner, Jocotoco Foundation, which has purchased land and created private reserves in Ecuador and manages these reserves, and has created one of the most incredible and important private reserve networks in Ecuador or any other country in the Andes.
Great, thank you. And another question we received from Gail. Gail, thank you for your question. Gail asks, I'm interested in a recommendation of a place that a group of elderly women birders could bird, possibly staying at one central location. Dan, do you have any recommendations? And also folks attending the webinar, if you've got any answers or thoughts for Gail, please share them in the chat. But Dan, any thoughts?
There are probably a lot of good places you could go, and it depends on. So I think what you'd want probably is something where you could fairly easily drive there and would have some feeders set up so you could sit and calmly watch things come to you, and probably not a lot of steep trail walking. I think in this area, the main lodge we stayed at in Mindo had hummingbird feeders in the garden and had a few small trails, but there probably a lot of different examples all throughout. I've never been to the Canopy Tower in Panama, but I've heard really good things about it. Maybe Mike, I don't know if you've been there, but I imagine that it's sort of the kind of place you can drive to, and then once you're there, you can see what's out on the veranda and experience that.
The canopy lodge in Panama is basically just for people who stay at the lodge. There is another canopy tower at the Nature Center on Pipeline Road. So that's pretty accessible. I just put in the chat. It depends where you want to go. I mean, if it's internationally, the Mindo area is pretty good for that, because you could stay at somewhere like Sachitamia Lodge, and you are half an hour to an hour's drive if you've got a tour guide to most of the places that Dan talked about. But if you want to stay domestically, I support like the Upper Texas coast in spring is fantastic. There's quite a few places around near Galveston area, Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge, High Island, places like that, which are great for migrants, and roseate spoonbills and least bittens and all kinds of birds like that. It's very accessible. And then the other place in Texas would be the Rio Grande Valley, anywhere from Brownsville, sort of following the Rio Grande River inland. There's lots of great reserves along there. So yeah, there's quite a few different places, but those are a couple that spring to my mind.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Mike. And thanks everyone that's suggesting different ideas in the chat. It's really great to see all the different places for birding.
Oh, I shouldn't forget Jocotoco in Florida. I'll put that in the chat. Jocotoco and Green Cay are both really great. Dan probably knows those sites as well.
I realized I meant to put that in the chat to everybody, but it only went to panelists, so I'll correct that now.
Great. Okay, and with that, we will be moving on to our next presenter. Next, we have Eliana Fierro-Calderón, ABC's International Conservation Project Officer, speaking on the conservation of the Antioquia brushfinch in Colombia. Eliana, when you're ready, over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you again for being with us this afternoon. As Kelly mentioned, I'm going to tell you about the new reserve for the Antioquia brushfinch in Colombia. But before that, I want to give you a little bit of background of what we have been doing with the species and how we got to this point. So the Antioquia brushfinch was described in 2007 based on specimens of museums that were dated back in 1971. But the information of where the species had been collected was incomplete. So we had this new species with basically no records or no information beyond those specimens. Many researchers tried to went out to look for the species in the wild, and there was no luck until 2018, when a student of the Universidad Nacional found it by chance just right outside of his place in the municipality of San Pedro de los Milagros in Antioquia, just right outside of Medellin. So since its rediscovered in 2018, ABC has been working with many local partners to learn more about the Antioquia brushfinch and to prioritize area for conservation. Next slide, please. So in the map, just in case you don't know where Antioquia is, there's the map of Colombia. Antioquia is a department in the northwest of Colombia, and this map that I'm showing you in the screen right now is that little like red rectangle in the map. This area is known as the Altiplano Antioqueño. It's basically like a plateau. And the area where the species was first rediscovered is that little bird that is in between San Pedro and Medellin. Medellin is the big town in the bottom. So yeah, one of the activities that ABC has been supporting since 2019 is the Buscatón, or big search. And thanks to this, we figure out new places where the species is located, but also we learn about what the species like. So for example, we know now they prefer shrubby habitats with short trees, which is very different to other species of brushfinch that are around because they prefer forests. And we also know right now that the population of the species is approximately 100 individuals. So in the map right there, you can see all these points are places that we have been during these big searches. The ones that are gray are places where we visit, but the species was not recorded. And the ones that had a little bird is where the species is. The colors are just different years for the first record of the species in those places. But yeah, as you can see, so we have like that little isolated point in San Pedro, and we have like a bigger area in the north, in the area where is San Antonio and Llanos de Cuiva. What's the thing? The Altiplano is the heart of dairy production in Antioquia department. And many people see those shrublands as not important or trash habitat. So nowadays, there are many and many acres of land being cleared for grasslands or crops, and the Antioquia brushfinch is losing habitat every day. So the last few years, we have been working with two local partners, Corporación Salvamontes and Corporación Neotropical Innovation, in that north section of the distribution of the species to protect habitat. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is zoom into that north section, and since our goal is to protect habitat, we are implementing different strategies. One of them is conservation agreements. So in 2021, we signed conservation agreements with 3 private properties to protect approximately 472 acres of habitat for the Antioquia brushfinch. And those conservation agreements are the properties that you can see that have a yellow boundary. It's 3 of them. It's only 3, but there is one that is kind of divided, but that's a big one. The second strategy that we started exploring last year is leases. So we are, since last year, we started leasing natural habitats in certain properties while we work with the landowners in a long-term conservation strategy for those properties. So for example, we have La Candelaria, that is that little kind of like U or C-shaped property that is with orange boundaries. And the idea in the short term, hopefully 2 or 3 years, is that this property can be designated as a municipal protected area. So the ones in orange are the properties that we are leasing right now, at least for 2 years more. And finally, we have the land purchase, and those are the 2 properties that are farther north with red boundaries. So this is the first reserve created specifically for the conservation of the Antioquia brushfinch. What was the important thing? How we decided that these should be the properties that were going to be the reserve. Most of these properties, that is approximately 880 acres, is shrubland for the species. There is a couple of patches of forest, but most of it is like habitat that is perfect and suitable for the species. And these are also places where the species was the most abundant during those big searches that I was telling you before. And in the picture, I posted the picture of a brand new sign for the reserve. That is the habitat that species like. Like you can see, it's really, really short, really messy, as Mike was saying earlier. It's really hard to walk through, and that's what they love, and that's where they are. So as you can see from the picture, we are planning all these as a network of different conservation strategies that allow to maintain this connectivity and kind of avoid that the population or different populations get isolated in this landscape that has a lot of pressure for agriculture. And just like last thing I just wanted to mention right now, like the reserve was created just at the beginning of this year. So right now we are developing infrastructure in the reserve, and hopefully in the future, this can be added to that webpage that Dan mentioned it. So you can go visit the species and support the conservation of the species. Yeah, that's all I have.
Great, Eliana, thank you so much. Great seeing the maps and all the areas. One question that we did receive for you is, the article mentions a new species of Antipata. Could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so this is still kind of a secret because the species has not been described yet. But actually, during the searches that our partners started in 2019, they found this antpita that is very similar to the honey antpita, but it, like, the song was different and there was something weird with it. So our partners started looking for it, kind of paying attention, recorded the songs and take some pictures, and they realized, after talking with many researchers in Colombia, that this was effectively like a new species of antpita. So right now, Neotropical Innovation and Salva Montes are working with the Instituto Humboldt in Colombia to describe this new species of antpita. The antpita has very similar habitat requirements that the Antioquia brushfinch, so it's also in the new reserve and in many of these other areas that we are protecting.
Great, thank you. And Mike, you put in the chat a comment about how Eliana's work is part of a large-scale effort by ABC and has already conserved more than 1 million acres for dozens of the most endangered birds in the Americas. Would you mind taking a minute or two and just expanding on that comment a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations to Eliana for what great work that this is around the brushfinch. So a couple of years ago, we began a gap analysis to determine which of the most endangered birds in the Americas were not properly or even at all protected. And Dan and his team have really been focused on this, trying to make sure that we have a safety net for every endangered species in the Americas, that they have at least one effective protected area. In the case of the brushfinch, we now have a few kind of connected protected areas. But we want to make sure that every endangered species has at least one safe refuge as a bottom line of protection against extinction, which is one of ABC's main goals, along with habitat conservation. And of course, these birds do need habitat conservation. So it's a huge effort. It's been going on for 15, going on 20 years now. We've made significant progress. A lot of times it means buying land, but it also means other things like sustaining these areas and protecting them long term. So it's a great part of our program, and we are going to work until we complete the job, which will take some time. But great progress, and thanks, Eliana, for the work you've done. That's terrific.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. And Dan, did you have a comment? I saw that you turned on your camera.
I would just love to say to this audience that I'm so proud of Eliana in this project, because she makes it look kind of easy. Oh yeah, we surveyed the birds, we found them here, then we started protecting the land. We've got this acreage now and birds protected, but it really wasn't that easy. And when we first found this bird, it was off this map to the south. I got to actually go see it. And months after I was there, part of the exact patch I was in got bulldozed for a farm. And it was by people who knew the bird was there and cared about the bird. And so we evaluated another piece of land that fell through. So this is really the best possible outcome after many different iterations and some lack of success in some parts of this bird range, because the threats are really that high. And I think this is the year that ABC and our partners really turned around the conservation trajectory of this species. Because I've been worrying about it for several years. It's been in bad shape, and I think this gives me a lot of hope.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
The last thing I just wanted to add, we are still working on this. As you can see, there is like a little gap in between the two properties we purchased. And the goal in the mid and long term is to connect those properties and keep expanding this network with all the different strategies and hopefully new strategies that we can figure out to work with the landowners in this place.
Great. And thank you everyone for the comments in the chat. Really appreciate that. And again, if anyone has any questions for Eliana or any of our other presenters, please share them in the Q&A Zoom box. And with that, we will move on to our next presentation. And next we have Naamal De Silva, ABC's Chief Diversity Officer, talking about Dawn Songs, a collection of poetry and essays that benefits ABC's Conservation and Justice Fellowship Program. Naamal, when you're ready, over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. I'm Naamal. My pronouns are she, her. I am based in DC. I would love to talk to you a little bit about this wonderful article that is in our current magazine, Dawn Songs for Birds and Humanity, a United Diverse Voice. I was going to read you a couple of poems that are not in the magazine, but that are in the Dawn Songs book itself. Read you a little bit about from Jamie and Drew about what they're thinking of with this and why they care about the Conservation and Justice Fellowships. And then to share a little bit about what the Conservation and Justice Fellowships are. We've announced them. We've had a first group of fellows. We haven't let you all see what they're doing quite yet because they're still wrapping up their work. So I'm going to do that, but I'm also so curious about what feelings birds bring up for you, how you share those emotions with others. The Dawn Songs is very much about emotional engagement. Drew Lanham talks about connecting head to heart to hand. And I think those connections are so important. I did about a decade of threatened species and protected areas work. And at the end of that, shifted to the work that I currently do because I strongly believe that we need more people doing that habitat conservation and bird conservation work. And one of the ways to engage more people is to engage their hearts. So here's a little bit from page 249 of the Dawn Songs book. The first to awaken begins to sing in the darkness. As the earth turns, day breaking, other voices, bird voices, join in. The dawn chorus is declaration, is reverie, is a reason for us to rise and greet the morning with wonderment and joy. The dawn chorus is mystery. It eludes the whys and wherefores of science. The dawn chorus invites apprenticeship to awe. And I love that for introducing the title, why Dawn Songs is the title of this book. I'm going to read you a couple of poems. It was really difficult for me to choose because there are so many wonderful ones, including the two that were featured in the magazine. But the first that I'm going to read is called Solace of Swallows by Gwendolyn Morgan. There are about 60 different authors in this book. It's very exciting to see all those perspectives, but swallows I find to be particularly appealing. So here we go. The violet green barn and cliff swallows return from Goya, Argentina, from Carrara, Costa Rica, from San Juan Capistrano to build and rebuild their nests of mud from Chicken Creek, with wild grasses and small leaves from maple trees cemented under the eaves of her house. Only one pair of cliff swallows this year, she says. She remembers hundreds, clouds of swallows returning when she was a child, white droppings along the porch like letters on the chalkboard, petroglyphs of ancestral birds. This morning, she draws outlines of children who have been killed in gun violence during border crossings, white chalk on cement. The swallows circle overhead, a sweet call in B flat. They carry our hearts with them. That's one. Here's another called Bird Watching by Kurt Main. Amid atrocities and injustices, unwatchable news, refugee tales, and unspeakable cruelties, after such losses and knowing the ground quakes with bitterness and unleashed angers, energies wasted in a time of need to no good end, and heaviness pulls even the most buoyant down. From on high up above, it just seems so obvious. It is the birds who watch us and watch over us, keep us untethered and able to connect, stitch and bind the world whole, migrating their lines to trace the life ways of all together. Odd to see a crane headed that way. That's the female calling, searching for a mate. That kestrel could hardly hold on to that mullein top. That high-pitched waxwing, see her perched there? Yet let us also give praise to the first trill chorus frogs and gratitude for friends, walking sticks, and ancients. That's another one. I'm going to read one more. It's a haiku. It's called Sandhill Crane Migration Stopover by Tina Asheray Fields. Ancient voices call from highest sky. See them? Sandhill cranes are back. Flocks of wanderers riding the sky on great wings, dancing joy at night. They're too vast to stay, but 1 week of their presence makes our life magic. These are the sorts of poems that are in this collection, and I find them to be so beautiful. It is such an honor that the proceeds of this collection support the Conservation and Justice Fellowships that we established. ABC established these fellowships last year in 2022. The first group of 8 fellows are finishing up their work now. We're going to be communicating some of their findings over the next while. One of them is an artist, and so those are visual works, but a lot of them are all about embedding ideas around social justice, human rights, human well-being, human flourishing into bird conservation, to emphasize those intersections and connections, to showcase that homes for birds, homes for people, we need to do all of that together. We have one that is, we have a lot about embedding Indigenous knowledge and stories into bird conservation work. There is one about pesticide exposure to birds and migrant farm workers. There's one to support getting a diversity of partners involved in the Bird City network that was recently launched. There's a bunch. I'd love to hear from you. I'll look at the chat now and the Q&A. But if you have any questions about ABC's Conservation and Justice Fellowship Program, please reach out directly, ask your questions now or reach out via email. I'll put my contact info in the chat. Back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Naamal. And yes, if anyone has any thoughts to the questions of what feelings do birds bring up for you and how do you share those emotions with others, if you want to put any thoughts in the chat, that would be great. One question that we do have is, can you tell us more about potential future projects for incoming fellows? Is it something that's kind of predetermined, or is it based on the talents and the interests of the fellows?
That's a great question. How we found the projects for the inaugural fellowships were entirely based on needs identified by staff members. That can change a little bit going forward, but for the first one, we wanted to see where were some gaps or opportunities where we were doing strong bird conservation work already, but there was the ability to engage new communities or to think about history of place in a more complicated way. That's how those arose. A lot of them, a lot of the supervisors for those projects, they're the ones who came up with the project descriptions, and then I provided support and helped sort of guide things along. For the next round, we'll have more of those. Some of the fellowship projects from this year need to continue in some way with a new fellow, likely. In the next round, we decided to have full fellowship projects every 2 years, giving fellows, they're part-time funded fellowships. And so it was about 12 hours a week for 6 months that they were with us. In the future, we'd like to give them more time to focus on the storytelling and reporting out. They spent a lot of time doing engagement of different partners and ABC staff and doing research. So for the next time, we're going to have a new set of projects, some of which continue the current projects. We did also get some interest from applicants and finalists. We had over 100 really solid applications for this first round. We're giving out some seed grants in 2023 to explore some of these specific ideas that applicants raised, and also other opportunities that have come up to see if they might be future fellowship projects.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts in the chat. And with that, we do have some time to open it up for questions for all of our panelists. So if all of our presenters could just turn on their video, and then maybe, Lara, we could have it set up where we're no longer showing a slide, but we can see everyone and then kind of panelist mode. Great. So a few questions here for the group that were submitted. This first question, let's see. Let's start with Christine's question. And Christine asks, I'm going to start teaching high school students this upcoming school year. What are the main things that people their age can do to support bird conservation? So I think it would be great to hear from everyone in this group. Any thoughts you may have on that inquiry from Christine?
Naamal knows a lot on this topic. Maybe she should kick us off.
I could get us started. That is an excellent question. We are at ABC, we're talking just this morning about environmental education opportunities and specifically bird education opportunities, education about birds, identifying common backyard birds, for instance, but also awareness about threats to birds and ways in which people can conserve birds. So I would love to be directly in touch with you, but as some quick ideas at high school level, service projects are a great way to get involved, whether that's like greening the schoolyard, planting native plants in the schoolyard, even working with the school garden to have more bird-friendly plants in that garden, things like that, bird tape and other ways to prevent collisions at the school itself. That's a really local way, but river restoration, tree cover and tree planting in your neighborhood, all of that could be potential ways to get students engaged in service activities that also increase their awareness.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I could just weigh in a little bit. I got interested in birds when I was pretty young, like 7 or 8 years old, but I didn't get interested in conservation of birds until I was much older, like 19 or 20. So it's a bit of a gap. And I think when I was kind of in my voyage of, I was still in the voyage of discovery, but when I was like in my most rapid voyage of discovery in the years like, 10 to 15, really what I was so curious about the world, I mostly wanted to know what birds were. And I think that was sort of sowed the seed that led to me becoming a conservationist later on. So to me, I think, not everybody's going to become a birder and get really interested in birds, but actually helping people learn what the birds are around them is the starting point to kind of that window on nature that birds provide. Now, I'll never forget one of my biology classes. We had a field trip out to the beach, and the teacher wanted us to collect starfish to take back to the classroom to dissect. And I had no interest in that at all. I had my binoculars, and I remember a common murre flying past, and I was watching it, and the biology teacher said, "Stop looking at that bird and come back over here. This is a biology class." And it just made me realize that there's kind of a disconnect there, and that if you can get people started on just recognizing a few of the birds around them, maybe that will be the handle that they can then latch onto, that will take them on a voyage of discovery that will lead them to becoming a conservationist later on and really have a true passion for it. So I agree with all the things that Naamal said, but I would just say that that's maybe an extra thing to think about, is just helping people understand the joy of birds. And you can have joy of birds without knowing what they are, but I think a lot of people who are birders like to be able to tell one from another. It's part of the joy of recognizing birds.
Yeah, it's a familiarity, makes you really love a bird, and the more you know in all the different ways, the better. Definitely.
Great. Dan, Eliana, any thoughts from you, or we're happy to move on to the next question? All right, we'll go ahead and move on then. We've got some great questions. So this question comes from Linda. Linda said, we have herons and egrets in our central Texas lake. I would like to know more about how we can support and help them without intruding. Any thoughts from this group on that question?
Well, I'll chime in. For one thing, I think that these egrets and herons are probably visiting the lake and coming to the people because the people are already not intruding so much. They're comfortable coming in, they're finding some food. They're probably breeding somewhere else. So that's one thing. There are a lot of policies, however, such as the Clean Water Act that help support wetlands and places that those birds breed. And so our listeners can use our action alerts at ABC to contact policymakers in Congress or elsewhere when issues related to birds come up. They can voice their support for policies that support those birds, such as Clean Water Act and other wetland policies and things like that.
Yeah, I could say a couple of things on herons. A lot of times water birds like herons can actually become quite acclimatized to people. If you go down to High Island, for example, the photographers are lined up with the roseate spoonbills and herons right, just a few yards in front of them. I think the most critical thing a lot of times for those egrets and herons that then a lot of them are colonial nesters and they have traditional nesting sites. And so a lot of disturbance, like, for example, new construction or cutting down trees where they actually nest would be probably one of the most harmful things for them. Disturbance by people, as long as you're not harassing them, you're quiet and don't get too close, is usually okay for most of the herons and egrets, as long as you're not really causing a lot of fuss directly around them. So it sort of really depends on the specifics, but I think the nesting sites tend to be the most critical, that's the bottleneck for a lot of those herons and egrets, and protecting those sites would be the most critical part of it. So understanding where they are, and if there's a threat to them, you could let ABC know, and we'd be happy to see if there's something we could do to help on that.
Great, thank you. And we just received this question in the chat from Grace. Grace, thank you for your question. Grace asked, will you identify specific ABC funding needs related to the areas presented in this webinar?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Not too many people always ask us that question, and we really appreciate it because, we can't do any of this without funding. And really the thing that we always need the most is actually unrestricted support, because we can actually raise restricted money for a number of the things that we talked about today. But it's never quite enough, because a lot of people want to pay for the actual project itself, and then we have to pay for Eliana's time and her travel. She needs to go down there. You can't manage these projects from afar. You have to go and understand the specifics, study them in detail to make sure we're doing a good job of managing the project properly. So that's the most important support for us that we can possibly get. But for all of these things, for a Latin American program for land protection, land acquisition, certainly, the sky is kind of the limit for that. We can probably spend as much money as we can raise, because there's lots of great opportunities to do really great conservation and buy land for these reserves. And so if people want to contribute to that, that would be wonderful. Our fellowship program, currently, we don't have direct, restricted funding for that. We are supporting out of operations for now. We do want to expand it next year, and Naamal would really appreciate some support for the fellowship program to build on what Jamie and Drew are helping with the book. And the work in Ecuador that Dan talked about, we're actually looking at a proposal now to really help develop that bird tourism even more and try and develop it as a real economic resource to really protect that habitat in the very long term. So all of those things we could benefit from some funding for, but operation support is always the most difficult for us to raise.
Great, thank you, Mike. And it looks like we have time for one more question. We'll squeak it in here at the end. And Naamal, this might be one for you. Monica's asking, how can our independent bookstores get on a Jamie and Drew book reading / signing tour? It would be a great way to connect more people to this book, birds, and ABC. Where are they based out of? So any thoughts on that question from Monica?
I love that question. So Drew is, I believe, in South Carolina, and Jamie is in rural Virginia, working for the Smithsonian. Drew is a full-time professor. They don't have a lot of time. Drew holds a lot of writing workshops and things like that. I don't think they have a book tour planned for this because this is a book published through Jamie's tiny independent press. But I would love to chat more about that, about possibilities for readings, but also birds and poetry events. We had one in April that was wonderful. Wherever you live, you could have a bird walk combined with a poetry reading. The 60 different authors also live in different places. So there's many opportunities. Even in Trinidad, one of the authors is from there. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you. And with that, it does bring us to the hour. If folks have any remaining questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us directly at info@abcbirds.org. And I'd just like to thank all of our speakers for sharing with us today and all of their great presentation and comments. And I'd also like to thank all of you again for attending this webinar and for all of your tremendous support and dedication to bird conservation. Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Kelly.
Absolutely.
You're doing a wonderful job coordinating this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone. Bye.